So again, we're going to be continuing on in what I have labeled as section 6 of Matthew's Gospel, and that is, the second to last section of Matthew. So we're, the end is somewhat in sight, I suppose. But this section, section 6, describes the events of Jesus' final visit to Jerusalem before his crucifixion. So everything leading up to the point where you really get into the last days of Jesus. We're talking about that. And I've titled this section, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders. When he gets to Jerusalem, this is very much a time for final confrontations, final pleas, really final everything. And of course, things do not ultimately end well from an earthly perspective for Jesus. Of course, everything goes according to plan from God's perspective, but there is a very decisive rejection of Christ, and Jesus knows that, therefore he addresses it ahead of time. Now, as of now, as we go through section 6, we've divided this into portions, and we're in the last portion of section 6, which I have overall called the Olivet Discourse. And of course, I did not call it that. Everyone else calls it that too. This is the Olivet Discourse, a sermon that Jesus preached to his disciples there on the Mount of Olives, just outside of Jerusalem, there in the last days of his ministry. This is Matthew chapters 24 and 25. And in this portion, Jesus predicts and describes the destruction of Jerusalem's temple, his second coming, and the end of the age. So it is a very far-reaching and sweeping sermon, very much covering history as it's going to be from that point onward, future history, with a special emphasis, I think, on the judgment on Jerusalem, but also getting ahead to the second coming. Now, most recently, I did a sermon which I called Shortening History to Save Humanity. So the last time I taught, which would have been several weeks ago, it feels like, I don't know exactly, but felt like it for sure. I was focusing on verse 22 of Matthew 24, which I'll just read again quickly to ground your memory. It says, "Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." And in my sermon on that statement, I argued that those days refers to the entire time between the first and second coming of Christ, and that the cutting short is actually the return of Christ at the end of the age. I mentioned that there are very much two ways to view this verse, and I very much argued for my view of it, but also mentioned the other. So I just still wanted to remind you of what my conclusion was as we move forward here. Now, having argued for all that in verse 22, we then face a great question. I said that the cutting short refers to the second coming of Christ, but that raises the question, is the second coming of Christ actually described in the Olivet Discourse? Is that actually here in front of us? Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to read the two passages that I want to discuss today. In my outline of the Olivet Discourse, I've divided it up into passages. I'm actually doing sort of a jet tour of the next two passages here today. For now, I just want to tell you, just so that we are absolutely clear and you know where I stand, that I do believe we are about to read some descriptions of the second coming of Christ here in the Olivet Discourse. I do think that is there. In all of my efforts to be fair and give everyone their due say as we talk about things, I don't want you to lose track of what I actually think on this. So yes, the second coming is here, and we are getting into that part. However, not every Christian reads the Olivet Discourse like that and thinks of the second coming as being here in the Olivet Discourse. So we have to give some thought to the question in order to be fair to those fellow Christians who are not of that mind. We got to consider what they say on this. Now, I previously mentioned a point of view called Preterism. This was a long time ago, maybe toward the beginning of my study on the Olivet Discourse. So if that seems like ancient history, it was ancient history when I mentioned that. Preterism with regard to the Olivet Discourse is the belief that the Olivet Discourse only describes events that happened in the first century. So back then, nearly 2,000 years ago now, there is the belief that the Olivet Discourse is entirely concerned with those events back then. According to Preterism, when Jesus describes the coming of the Son of Man, as we're about to see in the passages we're going to read, whenever Jesus describes the coming of the Son of Man, That does not mean the second coming of Christ as we think of it, according to Preterism. They have a very different view of all that. Now, today's sermon is mainly about the problems with Preterism. So I am ultimately aiming at sort of dispelling their arguments and dealing with their perspective in a very critical way, because I am critical of it. And that is also my title for today, by the way, Problems with Preterism. And my outline today has 3 headings, so I'll take you through those here just to show you what I aim to do. First, I need to further explain the question whether the next 2 passages of the Olivet Discourse have anything to do with the second coming of Christ. Mainly, that's a better explanation of the actual preterist position on these things and why they say that. Secondly, I want to spend some time discussing the 5 strengths of preterism in these 2 passages in order to be fair. I want to show you why certain Christians have adopted that view. It has obviously some reason behind it, and I want to show you what that is. And then finally, I want to spend the last half of this sermon presenting 6 arguments for seeing the second coming of Christ in these 2 upcoming passages of the Olivet Discourse. So most of the sermon, the entire last half of this sermon, is entirely, reestablishing a very traditional way of reading the Olivet Discourse as referring to the second coming of Christ, eventually in the Olivet Discourse. So that's what we're doing today. So today's sermon is my most dedicated sermon so far in answering the claims of preterism. I've brought it up before, mainly at the beginning of things, but today we're really going all out with dealing with this particular idea of the Olivet Discourse. That said, today's sermon will not be a final answer to preterism. I would love to put all the nails in the coffin today and be done with it, bury it, and just move on. But there are some nagging issues that are going to come back to us later on. When we get a little further on in Matthew 24, I'll be able to address those kind of final complaints at that time. For today, I just want to indicate the kinds of problems raised by preterism and make some kind of answer to them, and very much make the argument for the second coming here in the Olivet Discourse. And the rest of it, we'll just have to wait for another sermon further down the road. So my most dedicated sermon, yes, but not a final treatment. All that, though, kind of is how it has to be. So let's just go ahead and get into what we can do today. So I said the first thing we needed to do was further explain the question that we're asking today. I gotta be careful. My pages are not stapled anymore. I can't just turn the page like that. All right, so anyway, the question we're asking today, and the question before us, whether the next 2 passages of the Olivet Discourse have anything to do with the second coming of Christ. So let's read the 2 passages I have in mind, just to get them in front of us so you know what we're actually considering. So the first passage I have labeled, helpfully or not, as the Tribulation of the Church Part 2, because we come back around to something we've already seen in the Olivet Discourse, but here it is again. This is Matthew 24, verses 22 through 28. So here Jesus says, "Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then, if anyone says to you, 'Behold, here is the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe him, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, 'Behold, he is in the wilderness,' do not go out. Or, 'Behold, he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe them. For just as lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." So in this passage, Jesus primarily warns us against false prophets and false messiahs by telling us what the coming of the Son of Man will truly be like. And that's the whole main point of this particular passage. Now the second passage, the one immediately after this, I have labeled as the coming of the Son of Man, which is exactly what he says here. So let's go to verses 29 through 31. "But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. This passage is the reality which Christ expects to be counterfeited by all those false messiahs and false prophets previously mentioned. And here he describes to you what the real coming of the Son of Man is going to be like, so you can be watching for that and not be fooled by all these other guys. Now, as I said, the great question before us is whether these two passages have anything to do with the second coming of Christ. Is this the second coming, as we understand it, the day when Jesus Christ will bodily return from heaven to the earth to reign on the earth as the final great king of the kingdom of God and deliver us from our sins, from our enemies, put away sin and the devil forever, and everything be, praises to God after that. Is this that? Is that what we're talking about here? Now, for many Christians, the answer is an obvious yes. We wouldn't even think twice about it. Of course, these passages are about the second coming of Christ. What else could they be about? What other things might they represent here? And I myself am currently trying to prove that very point, that these passages are indeed about the second coming of Christ. I very much hope that you all will leave here today being further reassured of that point after having heard what I have to say, if you ever had any doubts. And yet some Christians do believe that these passages are meant to be a further description of the great tribulation of Judea, the judgment of God on Jerusalem in particular, leading into the true beginning of the church age, all happening back in the first century. So again, just to repeat that, some Christians are of the mind that these passages are really meant to be a further description of the great tribulation of Judea, the judgment of God on Jerusalem in particular, leading into the true beginning of the church age. And that is the preterist position. That is how a preterist Christian would come in here and read these and understand them. Now, since the preterist position may be somewhat new to you all, I want to explain it in a little more detail and just really get into the details of what they're saying on these particular passages. Preterism believes, as I do, that the great tribulation of Judea was the great Jewish revolt against Rome, ending with Jerusalem's downfall. Like we've talked about all of that already, and very much gone into more detail perhaps than you ever wanted on the great Jewish revolt against Rome. And I made the argument that that is the great tribulation of Judea. Preterism believes that very much as I do. According to preterism, the concern about false messiahs and false prophets in the passage I read earlier here today is limited to those years kind of leading into the great Jewish revolt against Rome and during the revolt itself. So these concerns about false messiahs and false prophets is very much a Jewish concern there in the nation during this time when basically their nation is disintegrating and Rome is on their way to just level the entire city of Jerusalem. False prophets and false messiahs in that time. Furthermore, preterism believes that the coming of the Son of Man, described in these passages, refers to the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans, but as an act of divine judgment. So it's very much a matter of just, God coming down, so to speak. It might be the Roman army and everything, but it's ultimately an act of God. And that's what the coming of the Son of Man is supposed to be in these passages. Finally, the sending forth of the angels to gather the elect from the four winds is simply a description of world evangelism. That it's a matter of, at this point, now that Jerusalem's out of the way, the gospel is really going to go forth into the nations, and that is represented by angels going forth to gather the elect. Therefore, these passages overall, according to preterism, describe the transition away from the nation of Israel as the people of God to the Jew-Gentile church as the kingdom of God. We're out with the old, in with the new. Everything representing the old covenant passing away, now moving on to the new covenant age. That is the idea of these passages as preterism understands these passages. Preterists understand the language of these passages to be apocalyptic, like the book of Revelation. So in the same way that I have recommended to you to read the book of Revelation, the preterist will come along and say, you should read these passages like that. You should read the Olivet Discourse in a very similar fashion. Preterists do not view these descriptions as literal, but as visionary, highly symbolic language to describe a great history-changing event in the plan of God, which is what apocalyptic literature is. It's like what the book of Revelation is. That same style of writing, that same attitude of writing is meant to be seen here in the Olivet Discourse, and we should interpret the passages in that same way according to preterism. So is the preterist correct about all that? Is that a right understanding of these passages? That is the question we're asking today, and hopefully will somewhat solve today. Almost did it again. Okay, so moving on to my second heading. I want to be fair in my attempts to answer this question. I don't like the idea of creating a straw man. I don't like the idea of just, casually passing over what people believe about the Bible without dealing with it. I don't like any of that sort of thing because I don't like being treated that way when I'm telling people what I believe about the Bible. So I want to be fair to the preterist and spend some time talking about the strengths of their position. And specifically, I have 5 strengths to talk about when it comes to the strengths of the preterist position here in the Olivet Discourse. Although I do believe that our 2 passages today describe the second coming of Christ as we usually understand it, I also understand why some Christians believe otherwise. And that's the whole point of this portion of the sermon, to show you why they believe that. And there are reasons for that they have some merit. So let's talk about these. The first point in favor of preterism is that false prophets and false messiahs were very active in Judea before and during the siege of Jerusalem. This was a real thing that happened. Again, to read the part of the Olivet Discourse that deals with this, starting in verse 23 here. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. In past sermons on the Olivet Discourse, I have read you some accounts of false prophets and false messiahs from Josephus. Of course, he was the Jewish historian that was alive at this time and witnessed a lot of this stuff that we read about there in the Great Tribulation of Judea. And there were false prophets, there were false messiahs, and there were, in the time leading up to the Great Jewish Revolt against Rome, and even during that time. That was a very real thing. So, to be fair, we could feasibly consider these verses fulfilled by the time Jerusalem fell, to be fair. The second point in favor of preterism is that apocalyptic language is real. Like, we're not just making up a category of language to come up with some weird interpretation of this passage. Apocalyptic language is real. If you have read the books of Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah, and Revelation, you know that biblical authors are capable of using a very visionary, symbolic, grandiose style of writing when talking about cosmic events or divine actions. When you get to that kind of theme, sometimes they throw out the literal way of speaking, and they very much adopt this very, big, kind of epic-sounding style in which there's all these things happening in the heavens and all this terrible stuff happening on the earth, and that's how they talk about things. Well, that's a very real style of writing. And the Olivet Discourse does have a very apocalyptic theme to it. Even the way I read it, I would say it is about the final victory of God against a wicked and hostile world. When it gets to the very end of the Olivet Discourse, that's what I say has happened here, which is a very apocalyptic theme. That is the kind of stuff that apocalyptic authors write about, and therefore you have to admit that the Olivet Discourse has this kind of apocalyptic flair to it. So preterism is being reasonable to suggest that these passages describe events not literally, but perhaps symbolically. That is a fair question to raise as we come to the Olivet Discourse. And preterism does raise that as a way of reading the passage. The third point in favor of preterism is that the fall of Jerusalem was a big deal. It was a tremendous deal. Apocalyptic language is always used for these kinds of world-shaking events. Anytime, God is really doing something in the world that people should notice, anytime the plan of God moves on to the next stage, so to speak, those are the kinds of things apocalyptic language deals with. When Jerusalem fell, that was a huge deal. For a lot of Jews at that time, it would have been a faith-breaking event. I mean, this is the kind of thing you never thought could have possibly happened. And here it has happened. And boy, did it happen. And did it happen in a grand way. We've talked about this and the details of the Great Jewish Revolt. I mean, Jesus is not exaggerating to say that this is a kind of suffering and a kind of tribulation unique to that time and place. I mean, there's been nothing like it. For Christians, now looking at it from the other perspective, the fall of Jerusalem signified the maturity of the new covenant in that Christ replaced the temple, the priesthood, and the promise of land, and all these things that are very much part of the old covenant. All that is gone by the time the Romans are done there at Jerusalem. And the new covenant age really has come into its full fruition at that time. So yes, we can see why preterism would suggest an apocalyptic description of the fall of Jerusalem in particular, and all this stuff about worldwide evangelism that is also there. I can see how the theme befits an apocalyptic style of writing, thinking about what happened there at Jerusalem and its significance for Christians. The fourth point in favor of preterism is that it fits the language of Daniel chapter 7, which is very important background for the Olivet Discourse, so I want to make sure this gets mentioned here. The whole notion of the coming of the Son of Man is from Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 through 14, which I do want to read to you right now. And this is very much jumping into one of Daniel's visions. Here we see some of this, apocalyptic style of writing, or proto-apocalyptic if you want to call it that. It says, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. Now, the language of that passage shows up often in the New Testament, but in various ways. Daniel chapter 7 is a pretty big passage, especially in the four Gospels, I would say. In Matthew's Gospel alone, we have seen it used to describe the second coming already, so far in his Gospel. But we've also seen it used in chapter 17, back in the transfiguration of Jesus and the events leading up to the transfiguration. There's a lot of borrowing there from Daniel chapter 7, probably meant to be a foretaste of the kingdom glory of Christ at his return. At least that's how I preached it back when I was preaching at that time in the Gospel of Matthew. So the language from Daniel chapter 7 doesn't always get applied directly to the second coming. It can be applied in other ways. For preterism to say that Daniel chapter 7 might be applied to the fall of Jerusalem, that's quite possible, since the fall of Jerusalem was the true rise of God's kingdom in the church. Again, kind of out with the old and with the new. The kingdom of God, as Jesus envisioned it and preached it, was fully formed by the time the Romans were done there at Jerusalem. There was now no illusion of God doing stuff there at that temple with this people. All that was gone. It is now all the church, and only the church. So you might imagine here, Matthew or somebody, or even Jesus speaking this way when he gives the Olivet Discourse, couching that in the language of Daniel chapter 7, because this is the coming of the kingdom that he has been preaching. And that's what's going on there in Daniel 7. He's being presented with his kingdom. You could say, hey, when Jerusalem was destroyed, that kind of happened at that point, didn't it? That's very much how a preterist would read this, and it does make some sense when you think about it. Now, I've given you 4 of these 5 strengths of preterism so far. And what you may have noticed with all of these is that none of them are really proof of preterism. It just shows that preterism is possible. it raises the question, is this what's happening in the passage? None of them, however, are sort of, yes, this is proof, this is evidence, this is something that cannot be, counter-argued. None of them are like that. To actually prove preterism, only really one passage seems to have that kind of influence. And this is a big one for preterists, and we've got to jump along a little further in the Olivet Discourse here to Matthew 24, verse 34, where Jesus says this, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." That is a verse we've not covered yet in the Olivet Discourse, but that is perhaps the chief argument of preterists. If you ever sit down with a preterist and talk to them, I guarantee you this is the first verse they're going to bring up when they talk about their point of view. And it is the only statement, I think, that has the possibility of actually proving preterism. If the meaning of that statement is exactly what they imply, which is that everything was going to be done by the time the disciples' generation died out, if that's what that means, then yes, preterism is proven true, if that is what that means. And preterists go here first, and it's really the only argument they have that could actually prove their point. Not just say it is possible, but to say it is proven. And that's a big one. And I'll have more to say about that particular statement from Jesus when I get there in a few months, probably. But for now, I will leave that with you to explain the appeal of preterism in the Olivet Discourse. There are 5 reasons, one of them a very strong reason, why preterists have come to the conclusion they have. So they're not just being weird, there's actually a reason for why they believe what they believe at this part of the Olivet Discourse. But I don't agree with them, and that's kind of where we're going in this sermon, and that's where I'm going next in my sermon today. Despite everything I just said about the strengths of preterism, I told you that I had 6 arguments for why I think these passages are indeed about the second coming of Christ. And 6 arguments may not be as perfect as 7. I perhaps could have got it to 7 if I wanted to, but I will say that 6 is stronger than 5, which is what the preterists have. So at least numerically speaking, we're on good ground as we get going here. So 6 arguments that I want to share with you for why I think the second coming really is described here in the Olivet Discourse. My first argument for why I think these passages are about the second coming of Christ is Matthew's use of the word parousia, which is a Greek word I've spoken about before in talking about the Olivet Discourse, but I want to give you that argument again because I think it is really, really important for weighing the benefits or the lack of benefits of preterism. So the Greek word parousia simply means presence. Anytime you're describing somebody's presence in a given area, you use the word parousia. Now in the New Testament letters, parousia is used for the presence of Christ when he returns. This is a word that gets used somewhat often as you're reading the later New Testament. And because it's about Christ's presence when he returns, it very often gets translated as the word coming. Whenever we're talking about the coming of Christ, the word parousia is very often used there, and we translate it as coming. Paul, James, and Peter, and also John in his letters, all use the word in this way. And I do want to read you one example of the later New Testament using the word in this way. I'm just going to very quickly read to you 1 Thessalonians Chapter 4, verses 15 through 18, which is a very familiar passage. But when you see the word coming, that is the word parousia, or presence. So, "For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. So we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore comfort one another with these words." So there is a passage about the second coming using the word parousia. And with passages like that, I find it very difficult to be a full preterist with regard to the entire New Testament. With passages like this, it's hard to deny that there is some kind of second coming coming, that there really is going to come a point where this sort of thing is going to happen. Jesus returns bodily to the earth to deliver us and finish up the work of God. Now, what's really interesting is that Matthew does something which allows us to connect the Olivet Discourse to the greater New Testament teaching about the parousia. And this is something very unique to Matthew's gospel. He is the only gospel author to do this. But Matthew uses the word parousia in the Olivet Discourse. Mark does not do that, Luke does not do that, but Matthew does. And he does it very deliberately, it seems. So I'm just going to read you a few verses here from Matthew 24. Each of these use the word parousia. It's usually translated as coming, so just be watching for that word. So verse 3, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Go down to verse 27. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Skip down to 37. We'll read through verse 39. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. In all those statements, Matthew uses the word parousia, this word that is used in the later New Testament, very much to refer to the second coming of Christ. For Matthew to use that word, parousia, indicates that he means to record something about the second coming, and not merely the destruction of the temple by the Romans or worldwide evangelism. He's trying to borrow the energy of this very Christian use of the word as it refers to the second coming of Christ. It becomes very difficult for me to ignore that and, treat the passages the way the preterist does and just ignore the use of that word, especially since Matthew seems to make a unique effort to get it into the Olivet Discourse. Matthew seems to be striving for even greater clarity than Mark or Luke, is what I'm trying to say on that. So there's my first argument. My second argument is that the false messiahs and false prophets could only be misleading if the disciples expected a bodily return of Christ to the earth. Okay, so dealing now with the false prophets and false messiahs and why they are found to be so persuasive. Let's read that passage again, starting in verse 23. Then if anyone says to you, "Behold, here is the Christ," or "There he is," do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, "Behold, he is in the wilderness," do not go out. Or, "Behold, he is in the inner rooms," do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Now, as we read the warning given by Christ, he assumes that flesh and blood men living in the wilderness or hiding in the inner rooms will present themselves as messiahs. That is the whole idea of this passage. They're going to be people on the earth putting themselves forth as messiahs. And Jesus brings them up in the Olivet Discourse. He includes them in his discussion of these things. Jesus goes on to say that such false prophets and false messiahs might even mislead the elect. People are going to find these men so convincing that even people, possibly, who are eventually, slated for salvation in the plan of God, they might be led astray by these people. It could happen. However, I see no reason why these flesh and blood, earthbound men could be so misleading unless Christ was describing a bodily return for himself to the earth. If he is, here in the Olivet Discourse, describing his own bodily return to the earth after having been absent for a good long while, if he is describing that kind of bodily return, then it makes sense for there to be men on the earth who are flesh and blood saying, "Hey, I'm Jesus, I'm the Messiah." That makes sense because Jesus told people in the Olivet Discourse that that kind of thing was going to happen, and here are some imposters coming in to try to steal Jesus' thunder ahead of time. All of that makes sense. And it only makes sense in that presumption there. Let's state that another way. If the whole purpose of Christ in these passages is that he would return symbolically to judge Jerusalem and evangelize the world, how could any of his disciples be misled by tricksters on the earth? If all he's talking about here, and if all we're meant to see here, is a symbolic divine judgment in the coming of the Son of Man, and there was never meant to be a bodily return, or he didn't mention it here, I fail to see why he would mention flesh and blood, false prophets, and messiahs here as well. Those two don't fit. They only work together. You have to have both a bodily return of Christ and then these men on the earth trying to present themselves as messiahs. To me, it makes more sense to say that Christ in these passages meant to describe a bodily return to the earth, and that some deceivers would try to fake that return to the earth to try to get followers for themselves. That is, I think, the only clear, cogent way to read all these things together. I just don't think it makes sense otherwise. I think preterism has a really hard time making sense of all that. And that's my second argument against preterism and for the second coming here in the Olivet Discourse. My third argument for why I think these passages are about the second coming of Christ is that Christ describes his coming as a plainly evident event. It is something that you cannot miss when it happens. Again, let's read here at the end of what I just read previously, starting in verse 27. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Just as no one could fail to notice lightning strikes or circling vultures, especially if you're the person underneath those circling vultures, just as no one could miss those kinds of things, even so no one could fail to notice the coming of the Son of Man. This is a plainly evident event. Now, this plainly evident event fits very well with the second coming of Christ as we believe in it. You know, in a day when the sky is going to crack open and Jesus is going to return from heaven to the earth bodily with all that glory and all these angels with him and judge the sinners and deliver his people and set up his kingdom in its fullness, you're not going to miss that. Okay, that is a plainly evident event. It's going to make lightning strikes and vultures look pretty pathetic by comparison. You're going to notice this when Jesus returns. All that fits. Meanwhile, preterism has proposed that the coming of the Son of Man in these passages refers to a symbolic return of Christ portrayed in visionary language. You know, so they try to make it, you know, in very much a symbolic return. Now, still though, the way the language is being written here, I mean, especially what he says here in contrast to these false prophets, it's something that men will notice. Symbolic or no, you're going to notice this. I mean, it's going to be like a lightning flash. It's going to be like circling vultures. You will notice this. The problem is that's not really how it turned out. Jesus seems to have been wrong on this point if the preterists are correct. After all, most people have no knowledge of the great Jewish revolt against Rome or the fall of Jerusalem. Most people in the world at that time, you go to other parts of the world, they don't know about these things. They don't know what's happening over there. Today, people don't know about this event from history. That's why I had to spend so much time talking about it from a historical perspective, just so you would know about it. It's been, for the most part, forgotten, even by people that perhaps should know about it. Among those people who do know about those events, historians, most of them would not say that it was the judgment of Christ. They don't think you have to bring Jesus at all into discussions of the great Jewish revolt against Rome, because to them it's not a divine judgment for the Jews crucifying their Messiah. You know, Jesus has nothing to do with it. It was a totally political, military event and nothing more. Even back then, most people would not have seen this event as the coming of the Son of Man. You know, they would not have viewed it in that way. The Romans certainly would not have viewed it that way. You know, the Jews who survived, you know, they don't give any credence to Christ, unless those who are remembering his words and converting because of them. You know, that could be something that happened back then, but not most of them anyway. For the most part, you take a poll of anyone who ever knew about this event, and most of them are not going to say it's the coming of the Son of Man. You know, clear as the lightning, you know, clear as circling vultures. None of them think of it that way. It's just it doesn't really fit. Jesus is trying to portray the coming of the Son of Man as something that everyone's going to notice, so much so that you shouldn't bother with these false prophets over here trying to kind of present themselves as the Messiah. But that doesn't really fit what the preterist is saying. Surely if the preterist were right, people should have looked at the judgment there on Jerusalem and the fall of Jerusalem and concluded from that plainly that it was divine judgment on behalf of Jesus Christ. But that's not what most people said. It just doesn't fit what the preterist is trying to say. It does, however, fit very well with the second coming of Christ as we typically understand it. So that's my third argument, from it being a plainly evident event. Now, my fourth argument is simply that preterism cannot make sense of the tribulations in verses 29 through 30, but the second coming can. And that's kind of a complicated statement, so I want to explain a little more in detail what I mean by that. Let's reread verses 29 through 30. What do I mean by tribulations in these verses? Okay, so verses 29 and 30. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. Now, from those words of Christ, we know two things for certain, right? So we're going to kind of bring this back down to two things that are indisputable. First, the coming of the Son of Man will happen after a tribulation. And that's just what he says here, right? Verse 29. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, that's when the coming of the Son of Man will happen. We could debate which tribulation is in view, because Jesus has mentioned two. There's the great tribulation of Judea, which is the Jewish revolt against Rome and that time period, or it could be the ongoing tribulation of the church throughout history, because he's mentioned that one as well. And he's called both of these tribulations. So he could be referring to either one of those, but regardless, the coming of the Son of Man will happen after a tribulation. So this tribulation stops. Here's the coming of the Son of Man. So there's the first thing we know for certain. Secondly, the second thing we know for certain, the coming of the Son of Man will bring a new tribulation of sorts for unbelievers. For people who are not believers in Christ, his coming is in itself a kind of tribulation. And the word is not used in this case here, but when you think about what's happening here, it's meant to sound like something really, really bad, a tribulation. When the Son of Man comes, the tribes of the earth will mourn as the lights of the sky go dark, which is not good. The whole language here, even if it is symbolic, it's meant to be something unnerving, something distressing. If you were outside and all the lights out there went dark, you would panic. And that's the kind of thing that's meant to happen when the Son of Man comes. Even if it's symbolic language, it's meant to be this very dreadful thing. And the tribes of the earth mourn when it happens. This is worldwide sorrow. Certainly not for believers, but for the unbelievers. And for that reason, I say the coming of the Son of Man will bring about a new tribulation for those unbelievers. So that's the second thing we know for certain. So first of all, the coming of the Son of Man will happen after a tribulation, and when he comes, it brings a kind of new tribulation for the unbelievers. Now, knowing those two things for certain, we can see that preterism has another problem. I don't think they can account for these two things. Preterism states that the coming of the Son of Man is simply part of the great tribulation of Judea, the crown of that time period, the worst of the worst, the actual end and consummation of this judgment of God. It is part of, the highest part of, the great tribulation of Judea. That interpretation falls flat if the great tribulation of Judea ends before the coming of the Son of Man, which might be what we just read, after the tribulation of those days. If that is a reference to the great tribulation of Judea, then that's a huge problem for preterism, because that makes it sound like it happens afterward, not during the great tribulation of Judea. Certainly not as part of it. Now, the only other option they have, from a preterist perspective, the only other option they have for the tribulation ending before the coming of the Son of Man is the ongoing tribulation of the church. that the tribulation of the church ends and then the coming of the Son of Man. And yet no preterist would say that the tribulations of Christians ended in the first century. They well know that the tribulation that we suffer has continued, and in many ways has gotten worse and worse in some places. So they're not going to say that either. They've got a huge problem there. Going back here to verse 9, then they will deliver you over to tribulation and will kill you, and you'll be hated by all nations because of my name, right? So all nations are going to participate in this tribulation of the church. Just because Jerusalem is destroyed and that persecutor of the church is out doesn't mean the tribulation ends. It's going worldwide here. Jesus said that here at the very beginning of the Olivet Discourse. The tribulation of the church is worldwide, and it would not end just because Jerusalem gets leveled. And the preterist knows that. So at this point, preterism has a pretty big problem that they face. At this point, preterism needs to escape this problem somehow, perhaps by changing their interpretation. But I don't think that is going to work either. I have proposed here, I'm about to propose a reinterpretation of the whole preterist understanding of things to kind of give them the benefit of a doubt that maybe they could escape this problem. I don't think they can, but let's go ahead with it anyway. Perhaps the preterist might say that the coming of the Son of Man has nothing to do at all with the Great Tribulation of Judea. Since that is such a problem, we're just going to throw that out. We're going to get rid of that. But the coming of the Son of Man only has to do with the beginning of worldwide evangelism. Just forget, all that stuff about the fall of Jerusalem. Let's say the coming of the Son of Man just represents the going forth of the gospel in power for the rest of the world. Will that work? Will that help them get out of this problem? No, I don't think so. As I mentioned earlier, we see that the coming of the Son of Man brings with it a whole new tribulation for unbelievers. There is a dark day coming for the unbelievers when it comes to the coming of the Son of Man here. And he's going to bring that with him when he comes, right? Preterism must include some element of tribulation in their views. It can't just be the gospel's going forth to the whole world. It can't just be that. Something has to make the tribes of the earth mourn. It has to be a dark day, even symbolically. It has to be a dark day for people when the Son of Man comes. There has to be some kind of tragedy, some kind of calamity, some kind of tribulation in their views. They have to have that in there, but they can't because it messes with the whole time frame laid out by Jesus after the tribulation of those days. You put all these things together here, preterism has, I think, quite a problem with it. And this is something that I think is a very big problem for preterism. Preterism cannot make sense of the tribulations mentioned in verses 29 through 30. Meanwhile, if we just say it refers to the second coming of Christ, no problem. It all fits. No problem. Especially if the tribulation he mentions in verse 29 is the tribulation of the church. But we'll get to that later in another sermon. But I think the second coming can make sense of all of this. I just don't think preterism can. I think they have a huge problem there that maybe they have not admitted to. So there's my fourth argument. My fifth argument is that the scenes of judgment in the Olivet Discourse only make sense if we separate the downfall of Jerusalem from the coming of the Son of Man. Okay? So we have scenes of judgment in the Olivet Discourse, which I'm about to read for you. I think those only make sense if we keep them separate from the downfall of Jerusalem and make them about a separate event, the coming of the Son of Man, which is a problem for preterism, but not for the second coming of Christ being in the Olivet Discourse. So let's read verses 36 through 42. This is right here in Matthew 24. Let's see here. Yes. Okay. So verse 36. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and the other left. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. So that's what I mean by scenes of judgment when I refer to scenes of judgment in the Olivet Discourse. Now, according to that passage, a time of peace and safety will be suddenly interrupted by judgment at the coming of the Son of Man. You've got everything going well, people eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. Then all of a sudden, doomsday. That's exactly what happens in this passage. It all gets interrupted by the coming of the Son of Man. Now, according to a preterist, this must refer to the great tribulation of Judea and the downfall of Jerusalem. These scenes of judgment here must refer to that. If everything here was about, things in the first century, and especially the downfall of Jerusalem, they pretty much have to take the passage in this fashion. I don't think they have any choice on that. However, I don't think anything in this passage fits the great tribulation of Judea and the downfall of Jerusalem. I just don't think it works when you apply this kind of language to what happened back then in around the year AD 70. I just don't think it works. The great tribulation of Judea was more like a slow, painful death, while the coming of the Son of Man is portrayed as a very sudden, sweeping judgment. And you can think back to all the things I told you about all that was happening among the Jews, the things they were doing to each other, and what the Romans did when they showed up. I mean, this was several years of just absolute awful existence. I mean, it was a slow death by all accounts. But that is not how the coming of the Son of Man is portrayed. It's like everything's fine, then like everything's not fine. It's just a very instantaneous change there. In order to account for these kinds of discrepancies, I think we have to say that Christ has detailed for us two different judgments in the Olivet Discourse. One of those judgments is on Jerusalem, the great tribulation of Judea, the great Jewish revolt against Rome, all that stuff. The other judgment is the coming of the Son of Man, which is his return to the earth to judge people. I think you have to say that. These scenes of judgment, I think, only make sense if we separate the downfall of Jerusalem from the coming of the Son of Man. Preterism can't do that, but we can. If we believe in the second coming of Christ that is described here in the Olivet Discourse, that makes sense to us. But preterism, I don't think, can make sense of these things. All right, one more argument. My sixth and final argument for why I think these passages are about the second coming of Christ is the parallel in Matthew 25. So jumping to the last part of the Olivet Discourse, I think we have some reason to take that and apply it here and just see what's really going on here. I want to read a passage from later on in the Olivet Discourse, and you tell me if this sounds familiar. Matthew 25, verses 31 through 33. So this is the very beginning of the sheep and goats judgment, as we see here at the end of the Olivet Discourse. Starting in Matthew 25, verse 31, I just want to read a few verses. But when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on his right, and the goats on the left. And he goes on from there to describe this particular judgment. Now that passage is very similar to what we see in chapter 24. There's a lot of shared language between these passages. The coming of the Son of Man, coming in glory with his angels to gather people. Like, those things are in both of those passages. I mean, they're very, very similar. Those are all features we can read about in chapter 24 and chapter 25. I think it stands to reason then that we can put them together and interpret them together. So what is happening in chapter 25? In the sheep and the goats judgment, what is going on there? Well, whether that language is apocalyptic or not, it's hard to see it as anything other than a final worldwide judgment, part of what we call the second coming of Christ. He says specifically there, all the nations are going to be gathered before him. I mean, that's explicit there. I mean, there's no apocalypticizing that. All nations are going to be gathered there in one place for this judgment when it happens. And that very much fits what we think of when we think of the second coming of Christ. When he comes, there is going to be a gathering of all nations for judgment. That's the whole idea. We're going to bring all this to a conclusion and get everyone where they need to be, so that his people can actually live their lives in joy in the presence of God. Now, if chapter 25 is about the second coming, and I think it absolutely has to be, if chapter 25 is about the second coming, and it sounds like chapter 24 is probably also about the second coming of Christ and not some local limited event like the fall of Jerusalem. It's very easy to come into Matthew 24 and interpret these things symbolically and say, oh, it's about the fall of Jerusalem. It gets much, much harder when you get to chapter 25 in Matthew. When you get to the sheep and goats judgment, that is a lot harder to reinterpret as being about the fall of Jerusalem. Maybe they do that. I don't know how they do that, but I don't think it's possible. I just cannot. In chapter 24, I've had my doubts. I come in here and say, is preterism true? Is this really what's going on here? And then I turn the page and I say, never mind. There's no way that's going to work there. I just don't think it can. And putting these two passages together, I just don't think preterism has a leg to stand on when it comes to the way they interpret these things. I think chapter 25 is a really good argument that we really are talking about some sort of worldwide judgment and not just the fall of Jerusalem, which means preterism is wrong in this regard. So those are my 6 arguments for you for why I think the second coming is here in the Olivet Discourse. Now, perhaps some of those arguments are more compelling to you than others. Perhaps you can think of some other arguments that I did not include. Nonetheless, the number of arguments poses a real challenge to understanding these passages as merely apocalyptic descriptions of Jerusalem's destruction and worldwide evangelism. It's really hard to maintain that against all we have seen. And it's not just the number of the arguments, it's the quality of the arguments, if you ask me. The fact is, preterism is problematic, far more problematic than the typical way of reading this passage as being about the second coming of Christ. I would rather deal with any problems of that interpretation than deal with the problems of preterism. Now, I have to admit, as I admitted toward the beginning of all this, I have yet to discuss the problems raised by verse 34, where Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." I've not dealt with that yet, and that is the strongest argument that preterism has. I want to do justice to that passage, so I am reserving it for when I get there in the Olivet Discourse. We will come back to this issue. But for right now, I think what I've said is sufficient to show you that preterism has a lot of problems, and you shouldn't just throw your hat in with them yet. Let's wait until we get to verse 34 and see what I have to say there. Until then, I've given you some reasons to think about preterism in a more critical light. And just to give you a summary of things, again, we talked about, that's the whole question here. Is the Olivet Discourse, does it include the second coming of Christ? Or are the preterists correct in saying that the coming of the Son of Man is just a symbolic way of talking about the judgment on Jerusalem? That's the question. And I talked about 5 strong arguments that the preterists can make. 4 of them really just prove that preterism is possible. One of them, verse 34, is a pretty strong argument that you have to deal with eventually. But that's all they have. They have those 5 arguments. Meanwhile, we can come in here with 6 arguments showing that this is probably the second coming of Christ here in the Olivet Discourse. And these pose a huge problem for preterism, such that I really don't think preterism has any real credence to it after you go through these things. That said, we will talk about verse 34 later on in my teaching of the Olivet Discourse. For today, that's all I want to say about preterism. So that's where we are now. Next time when I teach, we'll go on a little further here. We'll pick up in verse 22 again, and we'll talk about this passage that I've labeled as part 2 of the tribulation of the church, focusing mainly on these false prophets and false messiahs and the troubles they cause us as Christians here in the tribulation of the church, as Jesus has called it. So that's all for today. If there are questions or comments, let's go ahead and hear those here at the end.